Hello and welcome. This afternoon, my guest will be Dr. Sam Wilson, Professor of History, to discuss the Internship Program. Please stay tuned. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Richard Sachs, Provost at University of Rio Grande and Rio Grande Community College in beautiful southeastern Ohio. And I'm delighted to have, again for my guest today, Dr. Sam Wilson. I think in the 4 years of this show, I think Dr. Wilson is the first returning guest. So this is kind of like, who did Johnny Carson always have on his show? Back again and again. Number of different people. I mean, he made Jay Leno's career, Billy Crystal, other people like that. And if this were the Johnny Carson show, I would invite you over after your stand-up. But again, I'm delighted to have Dr. Sam Wilson here. As most of you will know, long-time professor of history. And history just recently went through a program review and made some very positive and I think proactive changes. So he's here to talk about the History Internship Program, specifically the way students can get direct experience working in archives and historical and genealogical societies, museums, things like that. So Dr. Wilson, can you talk about the program and the internship and the motivating factors in moving the department in this direction?
It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be a repeat one.
There we go.
As you well know, we went through the Memorandum of Understanding over the last 2 years with David Lawrence, and it went quite successfully. And we realized we had to be more competitive in today's market by updating our major, not only by changing courses, but by making an appeal to students beyond just the traditional aspect of history. So we've added a lot of incentives to the program, and one of them was, of course, to come up with an internship program. In that regards, we get students, let's say, to focus on more practical applications of history, because frankly, what we usually get is someone who will say, you know, Richard, what can I do with this degree? And those of us in the liberal arts oftentimes have a disadvantage with people in business and more technical fields, because you can see that linkage from computers to a job somewhere. Oftentimes you don't see it, although we know it exists, between history and a potential employment. And the fact is that many of our students want to know, is there something else we can do besides education? And there are a plethora of jobs available. We teach them this in our discipline. And we also don't want them to consider getting into great student debt, as often is the case. Pursuing Ph.D.s are probably not in their best interest because of the lack of jobs available. So we try to teach them that there are jobs such as working in museum studies, working in library science, working in the archives, where they can pursue their history interest and might even begin to, let's say, be adjunct professors at a local institution where they can actually teach, which keeps their interest in the discipline alive and gives them the opportunity to do what they really love to do. But in this case, we've been pushing in our seminar classes, in our even our introductory classes, that there are a plethora of jobs, and some of these are in museum studies, for example, where we have students who want to pursue, we have 2 of them this year who want to pursue work, and one in archives, one in museum studies, where they'll be in charge of collections, in charge of, let's say, determining what is discarded, how to build a collection, and they need the experience in that area. And that experience doesn't come without a price, and it means you need to go and work in an archive, you need to volunteer in your community, and the internship program is going to give them the ability to work at one of the local and even probably state historical societies or museums or archives in developing their skills and seeing if they really have the interest in that profession.
Right. Well, this is exciting to me because I loved history. If I hadn't been an English professor, I would have been a history professor. And again, a lot of my work's been in American studies, which is a combination of literature and history and other aspects of culture. But the one thing that really appeals to me about the direction the history department's taking is by having students do archival work, what that can do to their experience of the materials. I was always good with dates. I loved memorizing dates and troop movements and things like that. But I remember as a young professor in the 1980s, I was team teaching a course with a history professor, and we were doing the Civil War. And as we were teaching about Gettysburg, he photocopied 2 messages from a lieutenant to General Lee.
Okay.
And they're written in florid handwriting. And so we photocopied it for this large class of 100 students, and we had them in 4 different groups looking over it. And the one group that had this, they were saying, okay, now realize bullets are whizzing by, you're sweating, you're really nervous, you're being shot at, it's hot, and now you're trying to read this, and they're going, okay, from where I am on the ridge, oh no, on the river, oh my gosh, what does it say here? And it was so fascinating to see these students say, this is history too, it's not just the troop movements, but trying to decipher the kind of documents, and you'd have those kinds of documents in an archives, right? And,
Right.
And then how to handle them. I know all my paperback books from the 50s and 60s, they fell apart because they were high acid content, and I know there's all these ways to handle old things and how to retain things. And did you want to talk about some of those curatorial aspects?
Oh, well, correct. I mean, when they go to an archive, they may choose, let's say, to work at the Ross County Historical Society, for example, and Tom Kuhn is in charge of that. And, you know, real nice gentleman. Well, we used this before, he would tell me. We would put people, let's say, in the collections department, and knowing how to categorize things, knowing how to date things. So there's more to it than just, let's say, okay, reading the book or whatever the case may be as you did in the classroom. In this case, what you'll be doing is thereby someone donates a group of, let's say, papers to the Historical Society. You have to catalog each one of them, make sure they're preserved properly. And again, you're wearing white gloves because the preservation aspect is so important. And oftentimes, many of our students don't realize that archives, even I think the general public does not realize it. You'll be surprised what you'll find in someone's archives. I know in Rio Grande we have some of O.O. McIntyre's papers, even some Civil War papers as well. But for example, people will be hard-pressed to realize that in the JFK library in Boston, you can find Hemingway's papers. And they're there, and people once asked me, like, why is Hemingway's paper in, of all places, JFK archive? And I had to tell them that, well, after Hemingway died, of course, was the Castro Revolution, and getting Hemingway's personal items out was the work of the White House. So Kennedy assisted, let's say, the Hemingway family and got the information and archives and personal effects out of Cuba. And as a consequence of that, the family donated the personal effects or archives of Hemingway to JFK. So if you want to do JFK work, you can go to JFK, but also for Hemingway you go there. And so it requires a certain amount of knowledge to know that the archive may be of local history, but it may also include some documents or some accoutrements which may not be of vintage local work. It may be from someone, let's say, who traveled, who brought back something from India. And so you have to know this item, be able to identify it. There's a lot more to it. In addition, it's also learning the bureaucratic aspect of any kind of organization. They may be forced to work, let's say, in the museum shop one day. They may be forced, let's say, to go out and conduct tours. So taking them out of their comfort zone. Not only are you in the back doing archival work and organizational work, you're, you know, maybe putting together a display might be required of you. And so when working with the different archives, we're hoping the directors who will be assessing what our students are doing will engage them in a variety of different activities that are required in an archive or in a museum or in a historical society, so they get a full, you know, spectrum of what is required of them when they go to work in it professionally.
Sure. Well, that's fascinating to me that you said the archives are usually organized well, because, again, I haven't done the degree of scholarship you have, but in the limited scholarship I've done over the decades, when I've gone into archives, sometimes they're not organized well at all, and that's an interesting challenge as well. The only time I had a sabbatical was 1996, and from Michigan, I traveled to Northeastern State University in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the western band of the Cherokee tribe.
Okay.
And I looked at the Stand Watie papers. Stand Watie is the only American Indian who's ever been a general in a U.S. Army, and he was Brigadier General in the Confederate States of America Army. Those are the Cherokee Mounted Rifles who fought at Wilson's Creek and at Pea Ridge. And what I had to do was, I still remember, this is 1996, I was in a motel for $25 a night. I mean, even in Oklahoma in 1996, that was incredibly cheap. And what was so frustrating, the archives were open 9 to 12 and 1 to 5. So I could have all my stuff out at 11:55, and they were like, Dr. Sachs, we're going to lunch. I said, can I stay here? No, you can't. And I'd leave the stuff, they'd lock up, and I'd come back at 1. And then at 5, I'd go back. And it was very small town. I'd sit outside my door in the evening and drink some beer and look over my notes and then do the same thing the next day. It was one of the few times I've really had a scholarly trip. But what was so frustrating was some of them were just like, he was born in 1806, died in 1871, and a remarkable story both before and after removal. And he was part of the Ross faction. You know, there was a Ross faction and a Ridge faction within the Cherokee, but he was like Cherokee nobility, and he made made a lot of money at multiple times in his life. But what was fascinating, at times I found wonderful things, and at times I found like a receipt of how much grain he had bought, and a side of beef and stuff like that. Like, that's not going to help me at all with what I'm trying to do. So that was fascinating to me to see how things are cataloged. When I was at Fort Lewis College, which has a big American Indian focus, the Ballantine Indian Textiles Collection, somebody died and allowed us to digitize that.
Right.
So it's one of the best collections in the West of blankets and things like that. And the Ballantine family, which moved to Durango 100 years ago, they funded that. And while I was there, we actually had money, so now you can just go to the fortlewis.edu website and access all that stuff there, and you don't have to travel to Durango, which is a nice trip to make, but it's very expensive. So talk about some of the similar archives we're talking about here. Ross County and Chillicothe, Campus Martius, which I drive by in Marietta a couple times a month, and I've never gotten off. What's inside that beautiful Georgia colonial building?
It has a Northwest Territorial Museum. Okay. So when you walk in there, you can see, let's say, remnants of the old Northwest. Now, one thing about Marietta, it has more American Revolutionary officers buried in this cemetery than any other place in America.
Really?
Because of the territory open, part of what you got for serving in the Revolution was territory in Ohio.
Okay.
So they all went there, and many of them, I think there was 29 at least buried in the local cemetery.
First English establishment, yeah.
So, but you go in there, and it does have a nice collection there. They have a home you can go through in the museum itself, but it has a lot of, let's say, levels where you can go upstairs and see more 19th century artifacts, let's say, from the Civil War, guns, uniforms, people who served, let's say, in the county, in that area. But you go into an area where you actually see a combination of the history of Marietta and the region, beginning with the early settlements throughout up to the 20th century. There are, I think, automobiles. So it has a plethora of different of items and articles there. And we worked on a grant with them years ago. They're very, very active with the Ohio Historical Connection. And they have one of the archivists is a Native American, in fact, and he was very instrumental in helping us get the grant going because it was going to focus on Native Americans locally, particularly with the Shawnee. And so again, it's a very well-run museum. It's a nice place to visit, and Marietta itself has, as you know, Indian mounds there. It has a lot, as well as a lot of architectural, let's say, establishments which are turn of the century. Again, it's one of the first. It is the first settlement in Ohio, so it has a lot to offer historically.
Sure, sure. That reminds me of back in college, I was annoyed at an American History Survey course that I had to read a novel, as much as I love novels, and the novel was Burr by Gore Vidal.
Okay.
And of course it talked about, it was a very, I'll call it impressionistic piece of historical fiction that dealt with all the major periods of Aaron Burr's life, including his escapade on Blennerhassett Island.
Oh yeah, right there.
Now,
Yeah.
I've not traveled there, but I know about where it is. It's by Parkersburg, kind of.
Right.
Can you talk about Blennerhassett Island and that whole, what was it, 1805 or so? Was it really an attempt to start a new country or to start a revolution or whatever he was doing?
I believe Burr went to, was tried for that and was acquitted. So
Right.
you know, but he did, of course. There was a prospect of him creating a new country, and it's not that unusual because that was one of the concerns even with Jefferson during the period before acquiring the Louisiana Purchase. The idea there was so much territory there, the interest of the British and French, among others, and even the Spanish. There was enough land to create new countries, and there was a belief that how could America be one country from Atlantic to Pacific because of all that territory. It should be, let's say, much like Europe, where different countries
Sure.
would appear. And so it wasn't that, you know, it wasn't the concept that we have today, which might be anachronistic, that it was our destiny to create a country that would go from the original 13 states all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's a good credit to Jefferson for allowing, with the Northwest Ordinance, that any new state that would come into the Union would in fact have the same equal rights as the previous states. And that facilitated a very brisk expansion for that reason, because now if Indiana is admitted as a state, it has the same rights as Massachusetts or New York. And so new states realized that they didn't have to go through a process of being more of a colonial relationship to the original 13 states. That was a great incentive, let's say, to joining the Union. But yeah, there was, you know, again, a lot of Blennerhassett Island. If I don't recall, it's really, you know, not my area, you know. But,
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
It's the beautiful place, and of course, and I believe the original inhabitants of there, and some of the archival stuff is still there, but it was destroyed.
Exactly. I understand that they've rebuilt it.
Right.
And they've tried to rebuild it in the same era and things like that. But I think the original building was burned or something
Right, it was.
like that.
So
Yeah.
it's wonderful. One of the nice areas to visit, let's say, in our area. It has a great historical. It is of great historical value as you go up the Ohio, which was at one time one of the major, you know, thoroughfares in American history.
Right.
Until, of course, the railways took over. One of the interesting things is that with Frederick Jackson Turner and William Twait, I think his name is, who was also at Wisconsin. He came here in the late 1898 because he wanted to travel down the Ohio and see because the way it used to be back in 100 years before, you know, it was the main thoroughfare. But by the 1890s, railways have surpassed it. So he actually has to ship a boat down from Wisconsin to around Pittsburgh, and he takes pictures in a brand new Kodak film all the way up and down the Ohio River. And it's a wonderful tale. But he was a colleague of Frederick Jackson Turner. At the same time, Turner's writing about the end of the frontier, sort of looking at what America was like. What are we going to do now that there's no longer a frontier? Right. But quite interesting. You were talking about other museums. You know, it also needs to be pointed out that some of our students can choose where they want to go to. In other words, if someone's from Cleveland, they can actually petition to go to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Museum and get an internship there.
Or the Extraordinary Western Reserve Historical
Society. Exactly.
Yeah.
And we can work things out, and they can work there because the person doing the assessment will be the director there. Now, when they come back here, they'll be required to, of course, present what they've done, as well as, let's say, certain documentation of what they've done, but as well as addressing the Phi Alpha Theta history fraternity and explain their more or less efforts and accomplishments while they were on these internships. So it gives them a chance, let's say, not only to get the experience, but to present their experience at a proper setting. So in the future, if they work for an archive, as you well know, or a museum, they go to conferences and they present, let's say, papers on what their archives, what their collection. Your name is with the collection you create. People will go to a library, go to an archive, go to a museum, and they tend to build up or even start a new collection. So hopefully that gives them some kind of experience in that regard.
Undergraduate research, that's
right.
Great. Closer to home, can you tell about some of the opportunities like at the Our House Tavern in Gallipolis, and is it the Oak Hill Welsh Museum in Oak Hill as well?
There are two there. Any museum, historical society, or archive is available. Across the river in the River Museum in Point Pleasant can be used. I have good connections with the Kentucky Highlands Discovery Center which is in Ashland. But the Our House Museum is part of the Ohio History Connection, and knowing and working with Karen Hassel, who works for this Ohio History Connection and controls this area, we would be happy to set people up at the Our House Museum where they can, again, what they do is oftentimes related to the vagaries of the museum itself and what the director has as far as their responsibility. In other words, if they go to Columbus and work in the actual Ohio History Connection Museum, the requirements of what they'll do under internship will be probably quite different as opposed to what they would do at Our House, based on what's there,
sure,
which would be different from what they do as an archive. So they'd have to choose quite, let's say, astutely which ones they want to do and where they want to work. And there's plenty of opportunities. Most of this is just a phone call away. We contact them, see if it's available, make the arrangements. They go there and they work, let's say, usually for 120 hours of work. And it could be, let's say, 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week, depending on the time sequence, decided, let's say, in our arrangement with the museum. So it's a wonderful opportunity for our students to get experience where they can pursue a useful career in their love of history, as well as, let's say, in something that is not educationally oriented in the fact that you're not teaching in a classroom. There is so much opportunity available there, and I think they may want to pursue, well, I had one student, I said, well, I want to teach. Well, you may want to pursue a master's in history, let's say, it could be Spanish America, Latin America, and maybe you can get a museum study or library science degree and get a job as a librarian working for a university in charge of their Spanish collection, and maybe an adjunct in the history department teaching Latin American history. There are venues there where you can find jobs available, but you have to be innovative, which is what our new program attempts to do, and you have to be willing to go out and, make connections as well. Don't be so strictly stuck in a traditional path. Think outside the box. Think how we can help you. We're willing to help them do this, but we've had now some insight. We have one student at right now at James Madison University pursuing his degree in Josh Goodall in early colonial history. We have 2 students now graduating, one thinking of archival work and one thinking of museum studies. So we are making headway there. And hopefully, let's say, it can attract other students to realize that Rio Grande is more than just, let's say, a traditional education. We have that, and we offer a lot more.
Yeah. As you've been talking, I was thinking a good friend of mine, an academic, Craig Howe, curated the moving from the Gustav Hay Museum in Lower Manhattan to what is now the American Indian Museum on the Mall. With the Smithsonian, and one of the things that Craig dealt with, and when that museum opened, he showed me, they were trying to have people walk through and experience the artist. So as you come up to the second floor and they have these emerging American Indian artists, there'll be a big monitor with the young artist talking, and you'll see the pieces of art, and you'll be walking under it and around it. And so they're talking about how, and then there's appropriate music in the background, so it's a full experience. So I love actually going to a museum and having an experience at a museum. And I've even taught my adult kids, they do it, my sons in Denver and San Francisco aren't married, and they're like, Dad, I met this girl. I go, take her to the art museum, on a Friday night, buy her a glass of wine, and just see if there's a spark between the two of you. If she's got imagination, even if she doesn't love art, she'll love being in an art museum.
Well, they're so interactive. The Underground Railway Museum, you walk through, you find all kind of, but also there's, my wife worked at the Children's Museum in Indianapolis, where it's really hands-on activities there. There's and plus the collection act. And the one thing you got to worry about, you have to tell people no once in a while. When she was there, all these people want to donate Elvis plates. No, we don't have any room for this, or whatever. So you have to basically, and also, they have wonderful toy collections. You'd be surprised how many museums are out there. And again, when I approached Meigs County about this, they were thrilled to death. We've been looking for someone like this.
Sure.
So we're filling a need in our local area here, which is beneficial to our community.
In the last couple of minutes we have, let's talk about delivery modality and how people receive art, because I have an iPhone, but I hate doing anything on it except sending messages and calling. I don't want to access ESPN on my phone. I want to see it on a TV. And but I see increasingly, for example, in this area we have that Welsh Heritage Trail that is online.
Right.
And is the Morgan's Raid Trail also online, or?
I think they were attempting to do that.
Okay.
It's an awful long trail.
Yeah,
That's the
okay.
biggest problem. I'm on the I'm on the Buffington Island.
Because I see the
Battlefield
signs
preservation,
here,
yeah.
here and there where as I'm driving, I cross that trail.
Right. It's there. Part of it is, but it goes from Indiana, of course, through Ohio. Now we're trying to develop the battlefield in Portland, and it's a long, torturous process for a lot of reasons. So there are two major battlefields in the North in the Civil War. One is Gettysburg. One is, of course, Buffington Island, and it needs greater interest and greater support from the local community. And because of that, along the trail, some of it's developed, some of it is not. And we have people who've done videos throughout that. But I'm sure we haven't created, let's say, a full length, and it might be because of the distance for Morgan's Raid.
Yeah. Well, that's always interesting to me, how things are going to change over time. If you have something on an 8-track tape now, if it hasn't been modified into another format, it may be lost forever.
Right, you're right.
And so I wonder in the future, you know, a lot of things are going to be lost because they had it on their phone and then
it's wonderful to digitize it. I think that's the main thing. Even like I say, used to be at the archive, you were there, you get a pencil and a tablet, and that was it. Now you can take a camera, take a picture of a document, and it's so much easier today.
Right. Good. Well, it looks like we're counting down the last couple seconds of our show, but again, Dr. Sam Wilson here with some changes to the History Internship Program and some fascinating opportunities for young students studying history here at the University of Rio Grande. Thanks for tuning in.